Thank you. I should say, since that description was written, my ideas for the lecture tonight have evolved somewhat, and I will be saying much less than I planned to about historical debates and much more about the Constitution. I've prepared a handout. I'm hoping you all have one. I'm sorry for the small print. I did this because I wanted to get everything on two sides of one sheet of paper. Most of it is not from me. It's from the Constitution and also from a state constitution, the Constitution of Pennsylvania that went into effect in 1776. Pennsylvania doesn't have the same constitution anymore. I should make that clear. But the federal constitution, of course, is still the same one. There's also an outline of my talk. If you're somebody whose eyes glaze over when you see something like this, because maybe it reminds you of a class that you took in high school or something that you really hated, don't worry. The outline is much less important than the other material on the handout, but I wanted you to see where I'm going with these points that I'm going to make tonight. My topic this evening is the American presidency, not the president, but the office that the president holds. Now, it's hard to talk about these things, the person and the office, in isolation from each other, because the office has been shaped by those who've held it. And at the end of my talk, as you see on the outline, I'm going to mention some particular presidents who've been particularly influential. But I want to keep my focus on the office, the institution that we call the presidency. Now, Americans spend a lot of time talking about the president. And I don't just mean this president, the one who's in office right now, but every president. Right? They don't spend much time, as far as I can tell, talking about the institution that the president embodies. So I'm going to begin by offering some reasons why I think we should pay more attention than we do to that institution, the presidency. The first reason is that the presidency, of course, has changed over the course of American history. Now, I speak of the office of the presidency as if it was the same thing when George Washington was president as it is now, and of course that isn't true. It's partly true. We still have the same Constitution, so that much hasn't changed. But the presidency has changed enormously, just as the country has also changed enormously. I was trying to think of one good example to show how much the presidency has changed. I'm sure you could come up with any number of examples yourself, but I was thinking of the so-called nuclear football. Right? Whenever the president goes anywhere, he's accompanied by somebody who's carrying a briefcase. And this is called the football, for reasons that I'm not quite clear on. But it contains the nuclear codes. Right? So if the president needed to launch a strike at any time, he could do that. Right? This unimaginable power in the president's hands. So we might reasonably ask, has the presidency changed for the better? Right? Has the presidency grown into something that does more and more good for more and more people? Or has it grown into something that cannot be checked or limited in any practicable way? Right? That's the first reason for studying the presidency. The second reason has to do with the fact that Americans are often called upon to evaluate the president's job performance. Right? I've never gotten a call like this myself, but I know these kinds of surveys are done all the time. Right? Do you approve of the job that the president is doing? This kind of thing. Now, it seems to me you can't evaluate the job that the president is doing unless you know what that job is. Right? When it rains, we don't blame the weather forecaster because it's not his or her fault. Right? The forecaster doesn't control the weather. The forecaster only predicts the weather. So we might reasonably blame the forecaster if it rained when she said it wasn't going to rain. Right? But we know the forecaster doesn't control the weather. But when it comes to the president, it's much harder to be clear about what the president controls and what the president doesn't control. Not the weather, surely, at least I don't think so, but a great many other things. And of course, the president is only one part of the federal government, or I should say the presidency is only one part of the federal government. There are three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. What powers belong to the branch the executive branch as distinct from the legislative branch. This is important to know, right? But it's very hard to be clear about this. I'll offer a couple of examples. You can follow up with me concerning these examples if you like. One of them is NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement, right? We heard something about this in the presidential campaign. Of course, NAFTA went into effect under the presidency of Bill Clinton, the husband of Hillary Clinton, right? So it came up in the campaign. If you like NAFTA, if you think it's a good thing, who gets the credit for it, right? Does the credit go to the president? Does it go to Congress? Right? If you don't like NAFTA, who gets the blame? The president? Congress? Right? It's not very clear. As I say, you can follow up with me if you like. Another example that also came up in the campaign is executive orders. Right? We know that recent presidents in particular have issued executive orders from time to time. Are these a necessary and legitimate part of the president's job, or are they not? Right? One could, I think, reasonably take either position on that. Right. So 2 reasons to study the presidency. My last reason is this. It would be prudent, it seems to me, to understand the strengths and possible weaknesses of our form of government. Right? Our form of government is generally known by political scientists as a presidential democracy. Right? It's a democracy, of course, but it isn't the only kind of democracy. We know there are other democracies in the world. The other kind of democracy is parliamentary democracy. Right? And this is the kind that Great Britain has. Many other countries have it, some that were British colonies like India, others that just happen to have that form of government, Italy, Japan. Right? It's a very widespread form of government in the world. Ours is different. Right? One way that they're different is that our form of democracy is supposed to be characterized by strict separation of powers. There's a legislative branch, an executive branch, a judicial branch, powers associated with those branches. Right? The legislative power is separated from, the executive power is separated from the judicial power. Right? That's how our system is supposed to work. The president, of course, is an executive, right? The chief executive. He's not a legislator. And I know you're thinking, wait a minute, it's not as simple as that. But all right, this is the theory. The president is an executive. Congress is the legislature. The judicial powers belong to the Supreme Court and the other federal courts. Right? What is different in a parliamentary democracy? Well, in a parliamentary democracy, the prime minister is both an executive and a legislator. Right? So Theresa May in the UK, who is the prime minister at the moment, she is the executive, right? We'll leave the Queen out of the picture because the Queen reigns but does not rule. Theresa May is the executive, but she's also the leader of the party that has a majority in Parliament. So she's both an executive and a legislator, right? What are the advantages and disadvantages of these different forms of democracy, right? We should be aware of these because we don't want to be surprised if we find that, right, there's a weak point in our democracy. As much as I admire our democracy, I wouldn't say, and I don't think any reasonable person would say that it's, that it's perfect, right? I won't go into this topic in a great deal of depth. It really is a topic for another lecture. But I will say that the president is a much more powerful officer than he appears to be if we think of him simply as the chief executive. Right? On the other hand, the prime minister is a much less powerful officer than she appears to be if we think of her both as the executive and as the leader of parliament. Right? 3 reasons then for studying the presidency. I suggest a reasonable first step to understand the presidency is to consider the framers' view. That is, the view of those who framed the Constitution. Right? And that's what I propose to do. We can look at what the Constitution says, and we will do that, but we also need some context. Right? If you just pick up the Constitution and you have no sense of what the framers did that might be different from what other people were doing at the time or had done up to that time, then you're not going to understand very much of why it's important. So we need context. We need points of comparison. And I propose 3 points of comparison. They're on the handout. The first is that the framers rejected parliamentary government, right? And this is interesting. Parliamentary government is what they knew. They were British subjects. But they decided to organize the powers in our government a different way, right? This is also a point for another lecture. I'm not altogether sure why the framers rejected parliamentary government. I suspect it had to do with parties. The framers thought that parties were a bad thing. They hoped that we wouldn't have parties. Parties were already a well-established feature of parliamentary government, even back in the 18th century. So I think that's the reason why. I couldn't prove that that's true. So I wanted to mention this point of comparison, but I'm not going to develop it further. Much more useful, I think, is the second point of comparison. This is looking at the Constitution, but looking at 2 parts of the Constitution, looking at how the legislative powers are treated and how the executive powers are treated, right, and comparing them with each other, and seeing how they're different and trying to arrive at a conclusion about why they're treated differently. As useful, or I think even more useful, is to compare the federal Constitution with the state constitutions at the time, right? And I picked out, as I said, the Constitution of Pennsylvania as my example. And we can look at the executive power under the Pennsylvania Constitution in particular and see how it's different from the federal presidency. All right. This is where I leave off my prepared remarks, because actually I haven't prepared any remarks beyond this point, except in my head, of course. What I'd like you to do is to follow along in the handout. And I want you to look at the place on the back where there are 2 columns. The column on the left is the list of legislative powers, the powers that belong to Congress. And on the right hand, there is a list of executive powers, the powers that belong to the president, right? And the first thing you'll notice, I'm sure, is that the list of congressional powers is much longer, right? So you might think about whether this means that the legislature is more powerful or less constrained than the executive, or the contrary, right? Look at some of these powers. I think you'll agree that this is a list. I'm looking at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. This is a list that was drawn up with a good deal of care, right? And there's a certain logic to it. What's the first power that appears in this list? It's the power to tax, right? Of course, right? Where else are you going to start but with the power to tax? Right? All governments need money. This is how they get it, right? That is the first power of Congress listed, and also arguably the most important power of Congress. Sometimes, however, tax money is not sufficient. Congress can also borrow money. It has that power. That's the second power, right? Third power, to regulate commerce, but not all commerce. Only 3 kinds of commerce, right? Commerce with foreign nations. Why? Because the states individually are not competent to do that, right? They would all have their own trade policies, and it wouldn't work very well. Interstate commerce, commerce among the states, right? Again, the states individually are not competent to do this. We need a federal government to regulate commerce among the states. With the Indian tribes, right, that's a special category, not especially important in our time, but it was certainly important then. All right, a uniform rule of naturalization, so that, one state didn't have a rule for who could be admitted as an immigrant that was drastically different from another state, because that would create a lot of problems. Once somebody got into the United States, right, in the state that had the most liberal immigration laws, that person could move to states that had less liberal immigration laws and so forth. All right, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I think you can see that there's a certain logic to this, right? Now take a look at the corresponding list of executive powers. this list looks very different. Right? There must be some kind of logic to this, but it escapes me, whatever it is. Right? I do see that the power that's listed first, if we want to call it a power, is arguably the most important of the powers. The President is Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. Right? There are commanders. The President is the commander of commanders, right? The Chief Commander, the Commander-in-Chief. But otherwise, I mean, you could read through this list and you could think about it and tell yourself, well, you know, somehow this list of powers just doesn't really capture what the President is, what the President does, right? I'm sure that this list was created with great care because the Constitution was created with great care, but it gives the impression of being an almost random list of various items that don't seem to be very much connected with each other, right? So somehow the executive power is really not captured in this list of particular powers that the President has. Right? I think there's a reason for this. If you look up at the top of each column, on the left-hand side, I have underscored the words "herein granted." Which phrase is missing from the other column, right? All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, right? Those powers, that phrase, herein granted, clearly refers to the powers that are listed in Article 1, Section 8, right? So Congress is supposed to exercise just those powers and no other powers than those, right? Yes, it's true. At the bottom of the column, there's a kind of a loophole, you might say, called the Necessary and Proper Clause that says, actually, Congress can exercise powers other than the ones that are explicitly listed here if they're necessary and proper. But in principle, at least, Congress is supposed to exercise these powers and only these powers, right? But if you look at what Article 2, Section 1 says about the executive power, there's no phrase like that. It doesn't say the executive power is herein granted. It simply says, the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. Which raises the question, what is the executive power? Right? Is it something more than these things that are listed here? Well, many people have argued that it is. Right? The executive power is something which is bigger than all of the particular items that are listed here. Right? And I think that's true. At least the framers of the Constitution wanted some flexibility in the interpretation of the executive powers. Okay. I put a box around one power in particular because it's in a category all by itself. This is actually from Article 1. And we call it the veto power, but in fact, this phrase, veto power, is a little misleading. It's not presented in the Constitution as a power that belongs to the President, right? In fact, the word veto, neither the word veto nor the word power is used, right? I like this description of what we call the veto power. It's very, I know it would be odd if I said charming, right? But I do find it charming. Take a moment and look at that. The picture that this presents of the President's role is, I think, very revealing, right? It almost suggests the President is something like a benevolent father, right, who gives advice to his erring sons and daughters, right? So these are, if I develop this metaphor a little further, these are children who are already old enough to make decisions on their own. Their father, or it could be their mother, I suppose, says, you know, it's your decision to make, right? You can withdraw all of your savings and buy a sports car or something like that. It's your decision to make. I'm not going to stop you from doing this, but I wish you would reconsider, right? The word reconsider seems to me to be very important here. All right. I've mentioned Article 1, Article 2. It's very significant that these branches are treated in this order, right? It's no accident that the legislative branch is treated in Article 1, the executive branch in Article 2, the judicial branch in Article 3, right? It's because Congress is the central institution in the federal government, or really in any government. The legislature is the central institution in any government, okay? And this makes perfect sense if you think about it. I don't know if school children are taught this anymore, or maybe they never were, but I seem to remember hearing this definition of how the powers are different from each other, right? Congress makes laws. The president executes laws or sees that those laws are carried into effect. The judiciary interprets those laws, right? You've probably heard something like this. Okay, I think it's a very straightforward, simple but not simple-minded way of understanding what the branches do. Okay. Well, the president can't execute the laws unless there are laws to be executed, and those laws are made by Congress, right? So Congress's role really is central and fundamental. The executive's role is a little less fundamental, and then the role of the judicial branch is a little bit less fundamental than that, right? So this is the reason why the articles are numbered the way they are. Congress is the central institution, right? But we've also seen that the executive is less constrained than Congress, right? Congress has got this minute list of powers that they're not supposed to exceed. The executive has a much less minute, more general, broad, vague list of powers, right? Why is that? Do you suppose this suggests something about how the framers thought about the two branches and which branch might present more of a threat to liberty? Congress is tied down by those powers that are listed in Article 1, Section 8, right? It really is tied down or constrained by those powers. The executive is much less constrained. The executive has much more flexibility to interpret the executive power in a certain way, right? And this is something that the framers surely intended, okay? Partly, as I'm going to argue, so that the executive could check Congress. Now, we sometimes hear today that Congress is a check on the president. Well, this is exactly backwards, at least according to the framers' way of thinking, right? The framers understood the president to exercise a check on Congress because Congress is the central institution, right? And the veto power, as we call it, is the principal example of a check on Congress, right? But what does that mean? It means that the president participates in the legislative process, right? So the president isn't simply an executive, but also a legislator. And in fact, today, if you think about the president's role, the president really is a kind of legislator-in-chief. Isn't that right? The president is expected to have a legislative agenda. The president is expected to present that agenda to Congress, and Congress is generally expected, especially if it has a majority of the president's own party, to follow through and carry out that agenda which has been handed to it by the president. Congress is not under any obligation to do this, and we know Congress will frequently tell the president, in effect, no, we're not going to do that, or we'll do it later, or we have our own ideas. But the idea that the legislator, or that the president is a kind of legislator-in-chief is a fairly recent development in constitutional history. The older idea was Congress would do its thing, and the president would occasionally step in as necessary and ask Congress to reconsider when the president thinks that Congress has made a bad decision. Okay. So on the one hand, the president is less constrained, but on the other hand, the president really is subordinate to Congress, or the presidency is subordinate to Congress. All right. I'd like you to look now at the front of the handout. And again, I'm sorry this is so long. I didn't want to cut out anything. It's a lot of small print. It looks like the sort of thing that you get when you buy a telephone or something and you're supposed to say, I agree to all of this, and you don't read it. But this is important and it's revealing, so I'll give you a moment to take a look at that. So some of this language will be familiar, right? Some of the items in here resemble items that are in the federal Constitution. We learned that Pennsylvania had somebody called the president, that this president was actually commander-in-chief, right? This is before the Constitution was created. The states were on their own, really, when it came to defense, largely. But there's a plural pronoun, right? It's they. Because there were, how many executives? 12, right? There was an executive council, a plural executive, rather than a single executive. Okay? And the president, so-called, wasn't really president of Pennsylvania. The president was president of the council. President, I know it sounds strong to us. It sounds like a strong title. President actually means somebody who presides over something. Right? The president here is the person who presides over the executive council. Right? It's not a very strong office at all because, as you see here, there are virtually no powers that the president can exercise by himself. Almost all of the powers are exercised by the council as a whole. Right? With the sole exception, or I think the sole exception, of commander-in-chief. Right? That's the president himself, but the other powers are exercised jointly by all the members of the council. Okay? And you might think, this is a really crazy idea. Why have a plural executive? Right? A plural legislature, of course, because the legislature has to represent, right, the people. But a plural executive seems crazy because the members of the council are going to disagree with each other. If they disagree with each other, then the laws won't be executed. Right? And what if a decision has to be made quickly because of some situation that arises? The last thing you want to have is a council that's going to be squabbling with each other. Right? So it looks like a really bad idea. Well, why did they do this? And I should say Pennsylvania was not the only state to do this. All or almost all of the states had plural executives, or at least executive councils. Right? This is not like, I should add one more detail. This is not like the president's cabinet. Right? Because the president's cabinet is appointed by the president and is responsible to the president. The council are elected. Right? So they're on the same footing, really, as the president. They're elected by the people and they're responsible to the people. Right? What would be the reason for this? Right? Well, the reason is the people at this time, this is 1776, they were fearful of executive power. They knew executive power in the form of the king, right? The king and the king's agents who were appointed governors and such in the colonies, right? And they hated executive power. I don't think that's putting it too strongly. They acknowledged that executive power was necessary, but they really didn't like it. And so they made the executives weak. And they made them weak by dividing executive power among a number of hands, right? This is a fundamental principle in constitution making. If you want to weaken an institution, you divide it, right? This is part of the reason why we have two houses of Congress, so they can check each other, right? It strengthens the power of the president if you put those powers in the hands of one person, right? Well, clearly, the framers of the Constitution did the opposite thing, right? They made sure that the powers of the executive would be in the hands of a single person, the president. Okay. They learned from the experience of the state constitutions that the plural executive doesn't work very well. Right? States like Pennsylvania were characterized by strong legislatures, weak executives, and the legislatures pretty much did what they wanted to do. Right? The president or chief executive in the states was not an effective check. The legislatures were expanding their powers at the expense of the judicial and executive branches, right? There's a phrase that I like. It's used in one of the Federalist Papers describing this phenomenon, impetuous vortex, right? A vortex is, a whirlpool, impetuous, right? Can't be stopped. It's hasty. This is what the this is what the legislative powers were like in the states. They were like a whirlpool that sucked everything into themselves, right? So the framers of the Constitution said, look, we see what's happening in the states. We don't want to make the same mistake. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to make sure the president is powerful. He's got a veto. He can check Congress. And that way Congress will not, usurp powers that don't rightfully belong to it. Okay. This is where I summarize what we've noted already up to this point. The president is subordinate to Congress, a check on Congress, and because the framers feared that the Congress would exercise powers that didn't properly belong to it, they had to make the president powerful to be an effective check, right? But the president also serves as the protector of the nation, right? Commander-in-chief, right? So the president has to be powerful for that reason also. Okay. Now, a lot of history has taken place since the 18th century. The presidency, and this is not controversial, has grown stronger over time, right? The role of Congress has grown smaller, okay? This didn't happen all at once. In fact, it took a long time to happen. It didn't really happen until about the beginning of the 20th century. But now we have what I call a president-centric system, right? Everything seems to revolve around the president. And Congress has a very peripheral role, right? The president says to Congress, I want you to do this, that, and the other thing. And Congress may or may not do it, right? But it looks like the president is at the center of everything. Okay. How did we get here? Well, this is where I'm going to briefly discuss a few presidents that have helped to shape the presidency as we know it today. Lincoln would be the first example. Of course, as you all know, I'm sure, Lincoln exercised extraordinary powers during the Civil War. Okay? He did things that many people, many scholars, even scholars sympathetic to Lincoln, have said were not constitutional, or certainly of very questionable constitutionality. Right? He suspended the writ of habeas corpus. He authorized his generals to arrest people who might be cooperating with the Confederates, to put them in prison. They didn't have to be charged. They could be held indefinitely. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Right? There's nothing in the Constitution that says the president can sign a piece of paper and free all of the slaves in the country. Right? And I say this as a great admirer of Lincoln, right? Which I am. So I'm not criticizing Lincoln by saying this. He exercised extraordinary powers during the Civil War, right? And he was able to argue, because he was so good with words, that he had to do it. It was necessary, right? In fact, he says in one place, I'm paraphrasing, I had to do this because if I didn't do it, the whole Constitution would go to pieces, right? And if the Constitution goes to pieces, if the country goes to pieces, what good are particular laws, right? So if I have to break one law in order to save the whole system of laws, the whole country, I'll do that. Now, he didn't admit that he broke a law, right? But he came very close to saying, right, if I have to break one law to save all of the laws, I'll do that. Okay. So some scholars have blamed Lincoln for a kind of imperial presidency. I don't think that's fair, because if you look historically at what happened after the Civil War, we go back to a system where the president is not very strong, right? And Congress is, in fact, very strong. 2 times the president has been impeached, right? Not removed from office, but impeached. One of those times was Andrew Johnson, right? Lincoln's vice president, who was impeached and almost removed from office, missed by 1 vote, right? This is when Congress was feeling very strong and was, attacking the president with everything it had. These are the presidents that are really hard to remember, right? If you try to remember the presidents, right? If you start with Washington, it's not too hard. It's Washington, right? John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and so on. Those ones are not too hard. And then from Andrew Jackson to Lincoln, right? You've got a lot of forgettable presidents. And then In the 19th century, toward the end of the 19th century, again, you've got a lot of forgettable presidents. The presidency was very weak in the late 19th century. All right, what happened? Somebody named Theodore Roosevelt was elected president, who had a very different view of what the presidency should be. It's not just that, of course, it's a lot of things. It's a complicated story. I'm going to skip over Theodore Roosevelt for the moment and go to FDR and the Great Depression, right? The president as the protector of the nation, this is not a foreign threat. There's no war going on, but it is a threat. The country's economy is failing, right? And people wanted the president to do something, and the president did something, right? And when FDR was up for re-election the first time in 1936, he won by a landslide, one of the biggest landslides in American history, right? The American people wanted the president to step in and act forcefully to combat the Great Depression, right? A somewhat similar, or at least analogous situation, the War on Terror. The country's under threat, right? The president acts forcefully, and generally speaking, people support him in acting forcefully to protect the nation. Again, it's not exactly a wartime situation, or at least not an ordinary war. The War on Terror was an undeclared war, not clear who our enemies were, but they were not, state actors and so forth. Okay. The Civil War, the Great Depression, the War on Terror, three situations in which the president acted, I think, with the support of the people to combat a threat, and in doing so, without probably intending to do so, or necessarily intending to do so, expanded the power of the presidency and handed on a stronger presidency to his successor. Okay. I'm going to conclude with a quotation, actually a pair of quotations. This is from two presidents. Theodore Roosevelt is one of them, and the other is the man that Theodore Roosevelt chose as his handpicked successor, William Howard Taft. Right? Taft had a very different view, it turns out, of the president's role than Theodore Roosevelt had. And after they both left office, they both wrote books. This was something that I don't think a lot of presidents did before this time. Now all the presidents seem to write books after they leave office. But at any event, Theodore Roosevelt wrote his autobiography, and Taft wrote a book about the presidency, right? And this is a kind of debate, because Taft was aware when he wrote his book in 1916 that Roosevelt's autobiography, written a few years before, published a few years before, made a statement about the presidency that Taft thought was fundamentally wrong, right? So they're debating with each other in print. Here's a quotation from Theodore Roosevelt. He said, "My belief was that it was not only the president's right, but his duty to do anything that the needs of the nation demanded, unless such action was forbidden by the Constitution or by the laws." Right? The president can do anything provided the Constitution doesn't say expressly that he can't do it. Right? That was Roosevelt's view. Here's what Taft said. "My judgment is that the view of Mr. Roosevelt, ascribing an undefined residuum of power to the president, is an unsafe doctrine. The mainspring of such a view is that the executive is charged with responsibility for the welfare of all the people in a general way. The wide field of action that this would give to the executive, one can hardly limit." Right? That was Taft's view. Now, for all practical purposes, Roosevelt's view has won the day, right? The president can do anything that the Constitution doesn't say he can't do. But as Taft noted, and I think noted rightly, this view leaves the president's power almost without limits, okay, for good or ill. I suggest we ought to think about what that means for the future of our system of government, to have a presidency that, in effect, is unchecked and uncheckable. Well, thank you all very much for coming.